The year the sun turned black. Scientists have finally confirmed the worst year to be alive as a human being. Medieval historian Michael McCormick says the worst year in history was undoubtedly 536 AD. It was worse than 1349 AD when the Black Plague wiped out half the European continent. It was also worse than 1918 when the Spanish flu killed an estimated 100 million young people. 536 AD was the year the sun turned black and misery engulfed the planet. That year, a fog plunged all of Europe into a lightless realm of death and famine. Not just Europe, but also parts of Asia and the Middle East. This dark fog lasted almost 2 years, 18 months to be exact. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness for the whole year. The temperature in the summer dipped to just above freezing. It started the coldest decade of the past 2,300 years. Snow fell in places it had no business snowing, and since it was freezing all year, there were no crops to be grown. An ancient Irish chronicle recorded there was a failure of bread between 536 and 539 AD. That's 3 years without food. Then, in 541 AD, the Bubonic Plague broke out in Egypt and spread through the Eastern Roman Empire, and as a result, almost half the population of Constantinople was killed. Historians have known about the Dark Year for a long time. It's one of the reasons people still call that era the Dark Ages, but scientists have never been able to figure out what caused the fog to fall over Europe. But now, thanks to Michael McCormick and scientists from the Climate Change Institute in Maine, the truth of 536 may have finally been revealed. At a recent workshop in Harvard, the team of researchers announced a volcanic eruption in Iceland was to blame for the plague of darkness. It spewed ash across the northern hemisphere in 536. Then there were 2 more eruptions, one in 540 and another in 547. The ash blackened the sky, which almost seemed to signal the plague to be unleashed. This resulted in a century of famine, pestilence, economic stagnation, and widespread violence, making 536 AD the absolute worst time to be alive. The Boxton Man murder mystery. 700 years ago, a medieval man was hit 3 times on the head. Then his body was dumped into a peat bog. To make sure he didn't reanimate as a zombie and seek revenge, his killers jammed 3 wooden poles through his body, and afterward they let the bog swallow him. This man is known today as the Boxton Man, found in the peat bog in Sweden in the early part of the 1900s. He was in incredibly good condition when archaeologists found him. His preserved clothes show that he lived in the 14th century. His clothes were very impressive, and they seem to show that he must have been somebody important in the community. When he was found in 1936, he was still held in place by the wooden poles impaled through his body. And these days, he's one of the oldest cold cases in Sweden. Scientists have been able to tell a lot just from examining his corpse. He was between 30 and 35 when he died. The damage to his skull was likely the result of him being bashed in the head by a hammer or a pole. Researchers think he was the victim of murder. But why? The strongest hypothesis right now is that the Boxton Man was a tax collector. He may have been cruising around the Swedish countryside on behalf of a king, collecting money from the townsfolk. Even 700 years ago, people didn't like to pay taxes. So if this explanation is true, he may have been bludgeoned to death by angry farmers. There's currently a replica of the Boxton Man on display at the Halland Museum of Cultural History. Scientists used modern technology to fully reconstruct his face. You can see exactly what the supposed tax collector looked like before he met his untimely end. But as for those who killed him, it will likely never be known if they were ever brought to justice. The medieval time slip. In 1957, 3 young men were participating in a map-reading exercise. They were naval cadets charged with navigating across roughly 5 miles of English countryside to a specific point. If they followed the map correctly, they should have returned to base after catching sight of the remote Kersey village. But instead, the 3 teenagers stumbled upon a medieval village from the past, and it didn't come out until years later that the 3 naval cadets may have accidentally walked backwards through time. William Lang, Ray Baker, and Michael Crowley steadily crossed the picturesque British countryside. They were looking for the designated waypoint, but as they walked, they heard church bells ringing in the distance. When they reached the top of a hill, they saw smoke coming out of some chimneys, and beyond the chimneys was a tall church spire. As they descended toward the village, they started to feel extremely strange. The boys couldn't shake the unusual feeling that seemed to smother all three of them like invisible dread. When they reached the village, everything was suddenly quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the church bells had gone still. The autumn trees were no longer orange and yellow. Now they had a bright spring greenery to them. The breeze was dead, and the smoking chimneys weren't there anymore. The boys were walking through a village of timber structures. There weren't any cars or streetlights, and there weren't any people or living creatures within the village. The naval cadets were completely alone and were filled with fear. The village was bizarre, like something out of the past. The boys stopped at what looked like a butcher shop and peeked through the window, but all they saw was a skinned oxen covered in cobwebs. And as they continued to move through the village, they saw through the windows that the homes were empty. They didn't have any furniture and were completely deserted. Yet the boys still felt as though they were being watched by invisible eyes every step they took. Then, without warning, the weird feeling was gone. There was suddenly smoke streaming out of the chimneys, and the village was perfectly normal. It was such an epic event that it stayed with all three naval cadets for the rest of their lives. And decades later, William Lang started doing research on the town of Kersey. He remembered the exact building in which he and his friends saw the dead oxen. And after a bit of investigating, William learned the building was a butcher's shop in 1790. But it hadn't been in operation for many years when he and the other two peeked through its windows. What happened on that day in 1957 has never been explained. Many experts believe the trio of cadets may have accidentally experienced a medieval time slip. Because the church hadn't been visible during their episode, historians have suggested they slipped back into the 14th century. They would have glimpsed Kersey shortly after the Bubonic Plague devastated the town, which would explain the cobwebs in the butcher shop and the lack of people. What do you think happened? Let me know your theories in the comments. The mysterious Picts. The Picts, also called the Painted People of Scotland, were one of the few groups in the world who resisted Roman occupation. The Picts fended off Roman advances continuously from the 3rd century AD until the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Romans may have taken England as their own, but they were never able to defeat the Picts and capture northern Britain. Their isolation from the rest of the world allowed the Picts to develop their own unique culture. They set up a barrier to keep the Romans and other invaders out, which lasted until 900 AD. They were so unique that they used their own strange system of writing called Ogham, which has proved very difficult to translate. Archaeologists have also only found a handful of settlements and cemeteries. Even with all the modern technology of today, learning the history of the Pictish people is a huge challenge. Experts have been trying to understand the Picts since the early part of the medieval period in the 8th century. Early historians thought the tribesmen of Britain's north had emigrated from the Aegean Sea or Eastern Europe, but the truth is that they may have been the original inhabitants of Britain. A team of researchers from across the globe recently extracted genetic information from skeletons excavated from a Pictish cemetery. Researcher Linus Girdland Flink from Scotland's University of Aberdeen said the bodies came from early medieval graves between 450 AD and 650 AD. After extracting an almost complete genome, scientists were able to trace the genetic history of the Picts back to the Iron Age. Their DNA is unique to people from Britain, meaning they'd been on the island for a long time before the Romans ever showed up. Another cool thing that researchers found is that the Pictish DNA is still alive in Scotland right now. Modern-day people living in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have remnants of Pictish blood. Do you know your family's history? If so, where did some of your earliest ancestors live? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe. The shady medieval astrologist. Simon Forman was born around 1552 in medieval England. He was an astrologer, a title that was very important during the 16th century. Astrologers weren't just scientists who studied the stars, they also provided health care and were seen as people with mystical powers. University of Cambridge historian Lauren Castle said during the medieval days, people believed the movements of the stars and planets directly influenced human life. They thought there were hidden beams of energy that dictated certain things on Earth. It was the medieval equivalent of the moon messing with the tides. But since most ordinary people didn't understand how to interpret celestial movements, it was left up to the local astrologer to decipher the mysteries of the cosmos. Simon Forman survived a touch of the plague in 1592, and this helped elevate him to a strong position as a healer since he himself himself survived the Black Death. During his time as an astrologer, he kept a notebook in which he detailed all of his cases. 80,000 of Simon's cases between 1596 and 1603 survived in his notes. And today, all these cases can be seen online. You can even search by date and patient symptoms. Through his notes, researchers like Lauren Castle were able to learn a lot about the astrologer's unscrupulous behavior. Castle said that Simon frequently tried to seduce his patients. He made moves on almost every female patient who came to him and tried to get them in his bed. He wasn't the only immoral person around either. His case notes offer a shocking insight into medieval behavior. He outlined a case in which a man named John Wilkinson had gonorrhea. John had been spreading it to all the married women in his village, and even Simon described him as a filthy person. Then there was the tragic case of Alice Woodward, whose 8 pregnancies resulted in stillbirths. She feared witchcraft, which at the time was a perfectly reasonable assumption. Many of Simon's cases were dismissed as lunatics or people who were sick in the heart, and Simon couldn't help these sorts of people because he assumed they were either influenced by the devil or cursed by a witch. Mabel the Monster. In the 11th century, William I Talvas of Normandy was legendary for his cruelty. He killed his wife on her way to church because they had a disagreement. He occasionally blinded his enemies for fun or tortured those who opposed him. He was so horrendous that William's son, once he grew old enough, banished his father from Normandy. And banished alongside William was his daughter, Mabel de Bellême. She was born in 1026 AD in Alencon, and she took after her father. She was intelligent, and she looked just like him. She even shared his cruelty. Because they were from a wealthy family, William and Mabel took to their exile with a significant amount of cash. But if Mabel wanted to inherit the family riches, she'd need to get rid of her brother. So in 1054 AD, Mabel married Roger de Montgomery, and together they had 11 children. Roger was friends with the Duke of Normandy, ensuring that Mabel would one day get her inheritance. Legend has it that even while Mabel was married to Roger, she was plotting and scheming evil atrocities. She had a peculiar hate for monks. Her husband loved and protected the church, but Mabel hated how rich they were. So, in 1064 AD, she deliberately visited an abbey with a huge group of soldiers so that the monks would have to feed them, and this effectively starved the generous monks because they didn't have enough food for themselves. Throughout her life, Mabel was genuinely terrible to everyone. She played a game in which she caused nobles to lose their lands and fortunes. Being a cruel person in the 11th century wasn't great for longevity. In 1079 AD, while getting out of the bath, Mabel was murdered by a group of men who had snuck into her castle. It's believed that Hugh Brunel was behind the assassination. Hugh had been forced off his ancestral lines by Mabel 2 years earlier for no other reason than she wanted the lands for herself. It's never been proven that Hugh was responsible, but whoever broke into Mabel's castle cut her head off with a sword. The legend of Prester John. In the 12th century, a peculiar story began circulating through medieval Europe. A man named Prester John was supposedly ruling over a Christian kingdom crowded on all sides by pagans and Muslims in the Orient. It was said that Prester John was a descendant of one of the 3 magi who visited Jesus Christ upon his birth. His empire was full of riches and curious creatures, and it was located somewhere in India. The kingdom was a myth for 500 years. Some believed Prester John's magical land was hidden in Central Asia, but Portuguese explorers thought it was in Ethiopia. There was no shortage of myths surrounding the kingdom. The land supposedly had rivers of milk and honey. There was no crime, and everyone was peaceful and happy. People who lived there also made herbs that kept evil spirits and negativity away. The legend of Prester John became so popular that hundreds of manuscripts were printed throughout the Middle Ages discussing it. Explorers were so excited to discover the land of honey rivers that they went on wild expeditions to Africa and Asia. It was the beginning of an age of discovery. Prester John had supposedly sent letters to the rulers of all Christian kingdoms explaining his position. This was how the whole thing started, but the letters can't be traced back to a specific source. Some say it was Bishop Otto of Freising who spread the story originally, likely from a rumor he heard in Syria. But whatever the case, by the 13th century, everyone was talking about Prester John's kingdom. In 1221 AD, during the Fifth Crusade, the Bishop of Acre began spreading a rumor that he'd found a Christian champion named King David. He believed King David was the grandson of Prester John, and that he rode forth from the secret kingdom's lands in Asia. But in truth, the Bishop of Acre had found Genghis Khan. Genghis did destroy the armies of the Muslim Empire in Persia, but then he turned his golden horde on European Christians. Europeans continued to search for the mysterious land of Prester John up until the 17th century, when it became apparent that no such land had ever existed. Thanks for watching! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know what other videos you'd like to see in the comments below. See you next time! Bye!